Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, or R2P, is studied in the context of the 2011 intervention in Libya. However, it was not a successful application as it was faulty and incomplete, which later on jeopardized the use of the doctrine at all by the international community to protect civilian populations in areas such as Syria or in future conflicts. We learned a lot of lessons as an international community and as a country in Libya, such as the R2P must be comprehensive. The doctrine clearly states the military force is an option on the table. However, it cannot be the primary, the first, or the only tool that is used. And it must be complemented by other pressures such as economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and support for both the government to fulfill its sovereign responsibility towards its citizens, as well as to civil society as a whole. Regional support and buying was used in the Libya context to justify initial action, as Arab states requested the imposition of a no-fly zone. However, later on, the use of force was cautioned by regional leaders against being used for regime change, and that advice and leadership by Arab states in the area was then disregarded as other states continued to pursue other interests under the name of R2P. There were no safeguards against mission creep, so clear information gathering that tied the use of force to better outcomes for civilians was not used to justify continued force as the intervention went on. And we saw that observers and other non-force involved actions can preempt conflict to prevent it. However, justifying preemptive strikes and use of force to stop use of force is a very much more murkier kind of discussion that was not clearly endorsed by everyone in the region or using force at the time. And other interests and regime change can be unilateral interests by other partners that are separate interests, but they cannot be tied into this R2P mission. Otherwise, it puts the R2P integrity at stake. And you cannot justify changing the status quo at the time if you don't have a post-conflict plan in place. Clearly, the international community condemned Gaddafi's use of force against the civilian population and said it was unacceptable for it to continue. But in order to justify force, you must say against what possible outcome for Libya, it's both in the long term and in the short term. So just war theories, just war conditions of proportionality and reasonableness, you cannot determine those if you're going against an unknown variable, which you would be if there's no post-conflict plan. So this intervention definitely impacted international endorsement of R2P in a very negative way because failure leads to caution, especially an overabundance of it in the international arena where any consequences have a huge scope and magnitude. So populist states see the failure of Libya as a state after intervention as justification of their concerns, and this has to be addressed as valid by solidarist states. Theoretical challenges shouldn't be allowed to disqualify progress on the theory's application and to improve action and justify its use in the future, which means taking into account its misuse and creating safeguards against similar situations happening again. Applying the lessons learned to the Erehwon situation leads me to a number of recommendations. First of all, some of these things are already in place and they must be continued, such as sanctions, asset freezes, and diplomatic actions to pressure and isolate the government of Erehwon as well as the rebel forces from those providing them support. And a clear declaration that international humanitarian law and international human rights law must be followed and abided by all parties to the conflict and those on either side, both directly and indirectly involved. Secondly, there should be a call on countries with ties to the government, such as Russia and China, to pressure Erehwon, the government, into protecting its sovereignty by fulfilling their responsibility to the people. And by asking these countries to influence the government's conduct, then this will help incentivize them to avoid the use of R2P, which they're very cautious against, by preventing the need for it to be implemented in the first place. Thirdly, we can wait for the inquiry before taking any preemptive action, both through the use of force or through other methods, but the immediate deployment of observer forces to the region to document and to act should an escalation against the civilian population occur in the plain view and reach of observer forces, that should take place with their authorization to act only again if they're directly involved in the protection of such as civilian zones of safety. We need to call on the neighbors to open their borders to the refugees. We cannot cry that there's an international responsibility to use force against the Erehwon government and the rebels if we are not also at greater weight, placing responsibility on neighbors to support the civilian population should the government fail to do so. And that includes opening their borders with UN support from other countries that are not in the region to provide humanitarian assistance and security at the borders. There needs to be a commitment from coalition partners to forming a commission with the direct leadership and involvement of regional leaders to engage both the government groups and the Jamali groups if possible to explore negotiation and peacemaking options to end the conflict for a ceasefire, or in the instance of regime change, regardless who maintains or obtains leadership of the government, that there's assistance to them for civil society and government strengthening to prevent these conflicts in the future. And there needs to be finally clear restrictions on providing assistance of non-humanitarian nature to either side of the conflict, as well as clear restrictions on returning to observer status should the civilian deaths and atrocities cease. And ultimately, the defense element of R2P needs to work with humanitarian groups to provide protective zones for civilians and enhance the assistance to civil society and any government, regardless of who it is, to fulfill their sovereign responsibility so that the international community can again step back but not leave a void. Thank you for listening to these options, and I hope they're implemented.